Thank you, Paige. I'm going to give just a brief background on the Champlain Towers and what, as of today, what the status on the towers and the legal implications. For all of you, I'm sure you've seen, it's a 40-year-old building in Florida. It was 12 stories tall, 136 units, and the average condo sold for $100,000. So it was a nice condominium complex, but not what would be considered a luxury complex. And I suspect that the $100,000 range is because partly they kept their dues down by deferring maintenance. And that was one of the problems, is that they had low dues and tons of deferred maintenance. And in fact, less than 3 months before the collapse of the towers, the board president had sent a letter to the members warning that damage in the building had gotten significantly worse since the 2018 inspection. And in fact, the engineer in that inspection had said in his written report that concrete damage would multiply exponentially in coming years. And he had noted in the 9-page report that there was water intrusion coming in from virtually everywhere, from window frames, balconies, the pool deck, planters, and the water was leading to structural damage. And he had noted abundant cracking and spalling in concrete columns, and in beams, and in the walls, and significant cracking in the exterior stucco, which would, if you've got water going into the walls, could lead to also mold. And he had recommended additional study to find out basically the extent of some of these. And the association had then followed up with the cost to repair, which was a $15 million fix. And when you have a fix that large, it shows decades of deferred maintenance. And in fact, the special assessment was going to range from anywhere from $80,000 to $200,000 per unit, depending on the particular size of the units. So that, of course, inevitably led to a lot of wrangling and delays and infighting and directors resigning from the board as they grappled with just how to go about making these repairs. And then ultimately, before anything could be done, the building collapsed. And as of today, there are 97 confirmed dead and another, 50, 60 that are missing. And in fact, one of the missing is a board member. So as of today, also, about a dozen lawsuits have been filed, and a criminal investigation has been opened. And named, of course, the association, individuals, very likely board members, have been named. The building inspector, who had said the building was in very good shape just 2 years before the collapse, and he's now on a leave of absence. The city of Surfside has been named, and very likely because of poor building standards and code enforcement problems. The engineering firm that inspected the building in 2018 and pointed out all these problems has also been named. And they're arguing that the engineering firm should have actually gone deeper in the studying and looked at the structural issues more deeply, and should have notified the city of the problems. And then also the neighboring condominium building has also been named in litigation. It was because construction, this is very similar to the Millennium Tower in San Francisco, which was sinking and leaning. When they filed suit, they sued the city, and they sued also construction from next door, claiming that it was part of the problem, that the construction led to problems with the building sinking. And so how this impacts board members and managers. When they have something like this, where they know they've got a lot of deferred maintenance and problems, and then something ultimately happens that results in litigation, there's going to be a lot of discovery. And what's going to happen is not only the current board members for Champlain Towers, but probably prior board members will be certainly part of the discovery process. There are going to be depositions, Emailed traffic between them will be studied intently to find out what did the board know and when did they know it and what did they decide to do or not to do. And obviously, there were prior boards that decided not to do anything and to defer maintenance and do Band-Aid fixes, which is what then led to the crisis that they were at that was documented in 2018. And so what does that mean for these boards of directors? Are they going to be personally liable? Well, certainly there's going to be attempts to make them liable, and one of the defenses that they're going to make is the business judgment rule, which basically states that the decisions, if a board member makes a decision in good faith, in the best interest of the association, and after reasonable inquiry, they're not going to be personally liable for any mistakes in judgment that they make. So they're going to be focusing on the issues, these issues of maintenance and what decisions were the boards making. And unfortunately, I've dealt with boards where they've decided that it's in the best interest of their members to keep dues down, and they'll go for 10, 15 years or more with never raising the dues. And that's a huge mistake, because all that's doing is ensuring that at some point there's going to be a very large special assessment in everybody's future in order to play catch up into making repairs. Now, as of today also, there are at least so far 5 insurance carriers involved in the litigation. There's already been a hearing initially in the courts, and 2 of the carriers have already offered to pay insurance limits, which were $3 million on their policies. And the court has appointed a receiver to take over the association's monies and handle things on behalf of the association. And of course, there's right now they have nowhere to go. All of the people who did survive have to find temporary housing, and the court has authorized a receiver to pay out monies to the individuals so that they can at least have some temporary housing. But there's also a criminal investigation going on, so that there's probably going to be an attempt to pin somebody with criminal negligence. And that is at least the state of things for that particular, those boards of directors. And it's probably going to reach back a number of years for prior boards. So the takeaway here is that for current boards of directors, they need to pay attention to the maintenance. That is their number one obligation, is maintenance. That's why an association is created. That's why a board of directors is elected, so that they can take care of the common areas, because somebody has to do that. So that means boards of directors need to be looking at their budgets. They need to be raising dues if necessary, at least to keep it up with inflation, and to set aside appropriate reserves so that repairs can be made. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Robert so he can talk about the reserves.
Well, thank you, Adrian. I think you're going to hear a lot of similar themes from all 4 of us. But we've been getting a number of questions in our area of specialty, which is reserves. And many ask if just the reserve studies themselves are going to keep the building well maintained. Well, best practice is that 4 things are required to keep buildings, older condos, in good condition. One is that the board needs to regularly update the reserve study to get fresh information, because every year it gets further out of date. Number 2, the board needs to fund the recommendations per the reserve study. Number 3, the board needs to spend based on the recommendation for accomplishing projects in the reserve study. And there's a 4th part of best practice in keeping older condos in good condition. A reserve study identifies the regular cyclical projects. And as recommended in the CAI Research Foundation's recent Aging Infrastructure Report that was published in early 2020, it's in the best interest of an association to also have a periodic infrastructure inspection report by a qualified structural engineer or architect. And that inspection identifies the important difference between a minor cosmetic crack, something that can be covered by paint, or something that's a significant deterioration issue that's going to result in major repairs. And we already see those types of inspections already, at least in 3 regions. California has an exterior elevated elements inspection requirement every 9 years. We know about the 40-year inspection report that's required by 2 counties in the state of Florida. And there's also a 5-year facade inspection report in New York City. So that needs to be accompanied with a reserve study. And then we got a lot of questions about how often should you update your reserve study. Well, a good practice is a with-site visit update every 3rd year with annual adjustments and tweaks in the years in between. That's what we find an effective balance between the cost of reserve study updates and the danger of just letting the budget drift for years and years at a time. We also had a number of questions on the topic of how much should the association be setting aside in reserves. Well, that's going to be different for every building, and it's a number that's found in the reserve study.
That's Robert, actually, I have a question on that.
Sure.
Champlain Towers, what was their reserve funding level?
That's in answer to the next question. Well, yeah, they were 6.9% funded. Well, let me go right to that. How does someone know how much reserves they have at their association? Well, it's now public record that Champlain Towers South had about $700,000 in reserves. And to the average person, that sounds like a lot of money. But the reserve needs of the property at that time were about $10 million. So what's important at any point in time is the comparison between how much cash the association have and their reserve needs. And that's called, that comparison is called the percent funded. And it's now known that the Champlain Tower South Reserve Fund was 6.9% funded. That's in the 0 to 30% weak range, where special assessments and deferred maintenance are common. The 30 to 70% range is the fair range, where special assessments are infrequent. And the percent funded over 70% means that the property is in a combined strong physical and financial condition. And that's where special assessments are rare. So our recommendation is check your reserve study and check to see what range your association's percent funded is in.
Yeah, Robert, let me add that
sure.
On when the percent funding that is that low, 6.9, I've dealt with associations that have been in the 7 to 12% funding range. And they've ended up with really large special assessments and then getting sued for having not properly funded the reserves and imposing such a large special assessment on the membership. So I've been involved in a number of lawsuits where boards have been sued because of that. So the funding is really important, and boards need to pay particular attention to it, because they may be targeted in lawsuits for failure to properly fund their reserves.
Yeah, it gets into the question of what's a board member to know. And we're not asking significant things of board members. My aunt was the president of her association in Florida for, I think, a decade. She has administrative skills. She was an office worker for many years. We're not asking special things of board members, but they need to know what your numbers are. And you talked about that in the business judgment rule, the duty of inquiry, the reaching out for information. And that's part of the questions we've been getting, how much should we contribute? And that answer is found in the reserve study. There's 3 results in a reserve study. What the components are, that defines the scope and schedule of reserve projects. The reserve fund strength, that's the percent funded, and the recommended funding plan. And that's where you get your recommended contributions. And again, a number of people have asked us, what's the, if you had a magic wand, what's the biggest reserve mistake that needs to be corrected? And I would agree with you, Adrian, that boards need to adequately fund reserves. Ongoing deterioration is expensive. The roof doesn't send a deterioration bill each month, but that's a bill just like all other bills that needs to be paid. So our encouragement is to break the chain of poor decisions at your association and start making appropriately sized reserve contributions. That way you'll have the funds to make those timely repair and replacements. So boards need to stop focusing on the fool's gold of low monthly assessments and start focusing on their job, which is providing for the budget to provide for the needs of the association. And I'm starting to get a little bit out of my area of expertise as I'm talking about boards. So let me turn it over to Kevin. And Kevin, what questions have you been getting about board liability exposure?
Sure. Thanks, Robert. And I have to tell you, it's been interesting for me because 40 years ago, I handled my first condominium insurance policy. I've been handling insurance for condominiums for 40 years now. And for the past 20, my biggest concern has been this deferred maintenance that both of you have been talking about, that how every month the deterioration has increased and magnified to the point where we sit around, and my job is to look at these buildings and determine how much money it's going to cost to insure them, and should we insure them? Now, because what happened to this one building in Florida, we know what's going to happen. We're going to see reduced coverage, increased premiums, and limits reduced. And the sad part about it is that right now, Surfside doesn't have enough insurance limits. They're woefully underinsured. So you're talking about reducing some of that coverage they didn't have anyway and raising the rates. And the reason why, because I've seen two things that's happening out there, is that with deferred maintenance, you're looking at people who live in community associations looking at insurance policy as a maintenance contract. Mm-hmm. Believe that when that water leaks or that pool needs to be taken care of or the balcony needs to be fixed, they're going to wait and then submit an insurance bill.
Well, they're thinking of it as an accident, like when the roof leaked because of a storm or a pipe broke because of, again, an accident.
Yes. The problem, and that's the difference, is that they don't understand that has nothing to do with an accident. They want it because of the wear and tear of the association property. I'm going to blame you. I'm going to hold you negligent. I'm going to breach. I believe you as a board member breach your fiduciary duty because you did not maintain the property well. Because you didn't maintain the property, guess what's happening? There's water everywhere. There's the pools and the problem is that it is not a maintenance contract. If you look at a general liability policy, okay, it is an occurrence policy. So we know when that building fell down, that was the occurrence date. But if you want to sue because of the wear and tear of the association, I'm upset because, Robert, you were negligent because you failed to properly fund the reserve. And as a result, there's wear and tear. It's not a GL policy going to look at that and go, wait a minute, when's the occurrence? As far as the D&O contract, and I'm going to sue you for breach of fiduciary duty because you are a board member and you failed to take care of the common area, which led to leaky roofs and the pool being overblown and the balcony be fixed. The D&O is going to say, we have a problem because that's a property damage and property damage is excluded under the D&O, no matter if it's a breach of fiduciary duty or not. So what we need to do is make sure they understand that. The boards of directors understand that insurance, maintenance contract, you have to maintain it just like the two of you guys have been saying. But there's a second problem from an insurance point of view that's really, really things that bother us the most about that building coming down. When we talk about insurance losses, we're talking about economic loss. We're talking about financial loss. We're talking about somebody a slip and fall, maybe a drowning or breach of fiduciary duty because you failed to budget properly, you failed to maintain a common area. But we're talking about one person drowning. We talk about one person slipping and falling. We talk about one person maybe on the balcony or something like that. We're not talking about 100 people dying at one time. And that creates a problem for me as an insurance person because how much limit is that going to cost us? I mean, that means that right now we're not set up to handle those kind of claims. We're not set up to handle something like that. So as a result of that, we got to rethink how we're going to handle these kind of situations. So right now, I would say, if I want to give some advice, that you have to be able to communicate what's going on out there to your board members and managers. Let them know what's going on in association in terms of deferred maintenance. You have to budget. You're talking about, reserves, budget for the reserves, budget for them ahead of time. So you're looking at millions and millions of dollars. And above all, look for specialists who are in the community association industry. You can find somebody who do a reserve study, but are they accredited a reserve study specialist? Are they somebody who understands it? You can deal with any kind of lawyer, but they understand community associations. One of the biggest problems that we see is that whenever these things come about, it's always because they listen to somebody who doesn't understand community associations, doesn't understand insurance for community association or legal requirements, reserve studies, and the list goes on. So that's my recommendations. And I'm gonna turn it over to Tim Klein, who'll talk to you about the property portion of it.
Yeah, before it goes to Tim, I have a question for you, Kevin.
Sure.
I had said I've been involved in lawsuits defending boards who've been sued for, as you said, breach of fiduciary duties for not properly funding their reserves. And I've noticed that it's in buildings that are hitting the 30, 40-year marks that we're seeing this, where these deferred maintenance issues are really catching up and turning into large special assessments. Are you seeing an uptick in claims against boards of directors for breach of fiduciary duties related to reserves?
Yes, we are. And what happened, again, they believe this contract is a contract for maintenance. So instead of funding that reserves, instead of looking at that roof and saying we need to fix the roof, it's going to leak enough and we'll put a claim into our insurance carrier, to our HO6 policy. And again, it is on a DNO, the likelihood of being coverage is not, and on a GL, you may have the same issue. So you have to be able to maintain that property. And you nailed it, Adrian, you said it. If you maintain the property, you'll be in a better shape because you can't always count on insurance to bail you out.
Is that kind of like if your house burns down, you expect to have an insurance claim, but the insurance claim is going to be denied if you set the fire yourself?
Exactly. Or yes, exactly. Yes. Perfect.
Those are exciting liability issues. So let's talk about the property issues, because those are really maybe where the rubber meets the road. We got some interesting news today, and that is that Great American, the carrier who's on the property portion of the policy, has made a business decision to pay $50 million to go ahead and walk away from their obligation contractually for that association. By paying policy limits on the liability side, that means there's no longer defense. On the property side, it just means that the carrier can take their checkbook and go home. And that's been a business decision that Great American has made, which is very, very unusual. But I suppose because of the notoriety of this particular event, the number of lives lost, that they just decided they're going to pay the amount anyway. They might as well get it done now, and quash any future speculation about their handling of the loss. So that's the property coverage that the association maintains. In a common interest development, of course, an individual unit owner also maintains property insurance. They have contents, perhaps betterments and improvements inside of their home, and they have a coverage called loss of use, or if they're a landlord, a coverage called loss of rents. These are all within the definition of building coverage or property coverage. So those are the exposures now that individual homeowners or their estate, if they perished, will be looking at in terms of coverage. The interesting thing is I wouldn't expect that Great American was going to pay the property claim. I was expecting to join this webinar this morning and talk to you about the collapse exclusion and how robust that exclusion is and how well defined the various maladies that might cause the building to collapse would trigger coverage. I just didn't think that would happen. So that's a surprise. I'm not surprised by the fact that we will probably see the HO6 carriers be very, very stingy in terms of their handling of the property claims. I don't think they'll necessarily get their checkbook out quite as fast, but there will be claims made under those HO6 policies. And the HO6 policy has the same language that the master policy had. And that is, there's generally exclusions for collapse, building collapse, or for inherent vice, poor building materials, or deterioration. And so we think those will probably all come into play in this particular loss. Very, very sad loss indeed. It's too early to sort out the HO6 part of it. What I do know is there may be, you may have 20 or 30 different insurance carriers, and they all respond a bit differently in accordance with their coverage. One last coverage I'd like to talk about with regard to this loss is a coverage called loss assessment. there will be special assessments. And there may be a special assessment in this case to fund the defense. The board probably has a provision in the CCNRs that requires the association to indemnify and hold the board harmless. And the association may be struggling to find ways to fund that defense. And that's because I think that the general liability carriers are going to pay policy limits, so they don't have to provide the defense either. So there may be the coverage, and that's about a $15 million limit, by the way. My understanding is there's a $15 million umbrella excess of a $1 million underlying. So if there's 700,000 in reserves, there may be a $15.3 million shortfall if there is that much litigation that pursues this event. And it seems like it certainly could be that and more. So loss assessment coverage protects this unit owner against the special assessment the board may levy to cover these types of claims. There's a question whether or not they will cover any loss assessment portion of the loss directly related to the collapse. I think they'll pick up the liability portions of it. That is, if they special assess for the legal fees or the cost of defense, I do expect the loss assessment coverage to pick that up. What's interesting about loss assessment coverage is the date of loss is not the date that the event occurred. That is not the date that the building collapsed, but the date of loss for a loss assessment claim is the date that the special assessment is determined to be necessary and activated. And that's an interesting issue. And of course, this claims had so much notoriety. There's no agent or broker who's going to write loss assessment coverage on a unit there after a loss like this. But in other circumstances, a fire or other kind of perils, we might see special assessments levied and those picked up under the HO6 policy. So that's a lot of material, but that's the property exposures that we've been looking at and we'll continue to monitor as this kind of unfolds. And now with that, we've kind of set the table answering the questions, and Paige will now, we'll give her the microphone and let her help us manage to some.
Before Paige goes into the questions, I've got one for you guys.
Okay.
The two insurance guys. Since the carriers are paying out policy limits, that means they can walk away. They don't have to do any defense. So they don't need to hire attorneys, defend, and do anything along those lines, which means the boards of the directors, the board of directors, the association itself, and prior board members are going to have to scramble to find their own legal counsel to defend them. And this may be where the receiver is going to step in and do something along those lines to hire legal counsel. And it's just a huge mess. And it's something that boards and managers, whenever boards get sued, the association gets sued, the management company always gets sued with them. And that's why these maintenance issues are really so important. That, and this putting Band-Aids on things is not the solution. And if boards want to avoid potential liability and avoid, and here's another thing that they don't realize. They say, well, we've got a defense. Well, the problem is you have to go through the litigation. And litigation is extremely painful. And it is something it is absolutely draining. It's very stressful. And boards are volunteers, these directors, and they shouldn't have to go through this stuff. But if they're not doing their duty and they're not taking care of the property, they're going to find themselves being named in lawsuits.
And remind us of the business judgment rule.
What's that?
Remind us of the business judgment rule. Because these are average board members.
Yeah, that's one of the primary defenses is that if they make a decision in the best interest of the association, good faith, best interest of the association, and with reasonable inquiry, they're not going to be held personally liable. Well, here, they did the reasonable inquiry, which was, at least the board in 2018, they had an engineering study done. The problem then is, why didn't they do anything? How come 3 years later, there's still no repairs being made? And that's going to play into the litigation. And how come? And part of it is you've got a large pushback from the members. And I know that one of the things that I might be recommending to a board of directors is emergency special assessment. Now, there are actually restrictions, I know in California, in that it needs to be an emergency, not something that you were aware of. And the problem here is they were fully aware of all those deferred maintenance. And so I would have still said, I don't care. If this is a safety issue, you need to do the assessment and start making repairs immediately.
You know, Adrian, one of the things I think is interesting about this is that the next step is for the California legislature, states throughout the United States that have condo exposures, to pass a bill that requires some kind of mandatory inspection. And once that occurs, I would imagine it'd be very hard for a structural engineer to get E&O coverage if they do work on HOAs. I think the underwriter is going to say to this inspector, you can build freeways, you can build amusement parks and synagogues, but please don't work on HOAs. And so the E&O coverage, I think, is going to go rough. And finding a structural engineer you can rely upon that has enough E&O coverage that you can rely upon their advice is going to be a little bit difficult as well.
Yeah, I have a point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting. You brought something up that I haven't thought about. Once the GL carrier, the umbrella carrier, they all tender their limits, they walk away, receiver has that money. So now you have that current board of directors is being sued, the past board of directors being sued. They have to fund it themselves. And then you have no statute of limitations. So you have situations where their children, who may be too young now to sue, maybe suing 5 years from now or 10 years now to those same boards of directors because they were negligent and failed to do it. So this can cost a ton of money when these individuals who actually live there.
Yeah, and it's this tendency by boards to defer, and not to raise dues and to buckle under pressure from the members is commonplace. In fact, it's such a problem that the Foundation for Community Association Research decided to do a study which they produced last year called Breaking Point. And it dealt with this problem, this issue where boards just they want to defer maintenance. And even when they're faced with a crisis where they have to make some kind of repairs, they tend to engage in temporary repairs instead of comprehensive repairs. And that's why I think there's going to need to be some legislation that is going to allow boards to lean on to say, okay, we have no choice. We need to be properly funding our reserves. We have to make repairs. And I think there's going to be legislation coming down.
I think it's going to take a huge educating process. And I think a lot of the responsibility falls on our own shoulders. I think I was buying a condo in a coastal community. And the agent and broker was so excited to show me this condo. And one of the benefits of living in this particular association, which was a 2-unit association, by the way, is that there was no active HOA. It's fabulous. And there's no homeowners dues. There's no HOA. Is that great?
Oh.
Well, I think you might be talking to the wrong person. And I explained for her over the next half hour everything that could possibly go wrong and why HOA is important. And it was eye-opening to me, though, but maybe not that uncommon for there to be people in the community that really don't understand how HOAs work and why why the regular assessments are important, why reserve study is absolutely key, and why funding it makes so much sense.
Yeah. I think there's an integration here that we're talking about between the board and the owners, where they need to get a little more closely aligned. And that's a communication, a caring, and helping the owners understand that just like when you have a car, you expect to do an oil change. Or if you don't do that oil change, it's going to be very expensive. You're going to burn an engine. And I think there needs to be this education process that you talk about, Tim, where the owners have to get more on board with understanding that the board is not being evil by saying we need to raise our assessments a little bit each year to keep up with inflation and pay for the regular things that need to happen. The owners need to understand that, yep, buildings are expensive.
I just think it's going to be a very interesting time for structural engineers, for people who want to serve on boards who may be reticent, maybe very reticent now about serving on the boards. So I think there's going to be more run by receivers. It's just going to be an interesting time. Very interesting. Well, with that, I think we better pass it over to Paige to do some Q&A work, and we'll see if we can re-answer some of these questions again.